Hi, my name is Travis McVeigh. I'm a board-certified anesthesiologist from Dallas, Texas. This is my podcast called Thank You Notes. It's a show about gratitude, medicine, and just feeling good. My guest today is Dr. Josh Blum. He is a child and adolescent psychiatrist from Pennsylvania. Josh and I crossed paths on a Facebook group for doctors that are fathers. He has started a podcast recently called Revive and Thrive. It's centered on burnout specifically for people just like us, Dr. Dads. We talk about his reasons for starting the podcast, his own experience with burnout, and the ways he's been keeping it at bay. So now let's get into my talk with Dr. Josh Blum. Well, welcome to this episode of the Thank You Notes podcast. I'm here with my guest, Josh Blum. Josh, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you for asking. We'll ask this first question that I ask everybody. Do you write thank you notes?
I do, yeah.
And what was the last one you wrote for?
I think the last one that I wrote, my kids had birthdays relatively recently, and I had helped them finish up some ones that they had started. So that was one. And then, but that wasn't really me. I think the last actual one I did, it was actually for a guest for my own podcast. And I was thanking them for some work they had done a number of years ago. So that was probably the last one that I had done.
What is your podcast and what is it about?
I had started a podcast back in 2014, I think. Yeah. At the time, my daughter was just born, and that's obviously a great time to start anything. Is when you start kids. I decided I was going to publish a book then. So I had written a book, an early draft of a book when I was finished high school, and then I've been slowly editing it over the years. And then I don't know, for whatever reason, I decided that was the time. So that's what I did. And then in order to proofread the book, I figured I would read it aloud. And I'd gotten the idea, I think, that I would record it in little chunks. And at the time, this was like 2014, right? And so I don't think podcasts were quite as much of a thing as they are now. It was a smaller group of people that knew of them and did them. It certainly wasn't really mainstream. I don't even know if Apple Podcast, it wasn't called Apple, iTunes or whatever. I don't even know if they had it on there. But anyway, that's what I decided to do, is that for just basically proofreading. And then, so the first 15 episodes of my show are me basically reading, and I don't know, like a third draft basically of my book as a way of proofreading it. And I was actually literally holding my daughter, who was an infant at the time, in my arms. And so when she would fall asleep, essentially I would read the book until she would wake up. And so sometimes I'd get through 2 pages, sometimes I would get through 20 pages, but that's how it started. And then it kind of evolved into a lot of the stuff I write is influenced by the 80s. And so, 80s movies and things like that, and a lot of other creative things that I've done over the years, music and a lot of crafty kind of things, I guess you could say, like making various things. I like to work with my hands. And so, illustrations and making various things, started making toys for my kids. And that became a whole thing. And, making characters from books I had written, into essentially like 3D, like sculpts and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so it's become a whole thing. But it's something that I've done weekly basically since that point.
So what's the name of the podcast and what is it about?
Well, it's hard to characterize. I would say it's the name is the 13th Hour Podcast. It's the name of the book. One of the main books that I've written is called The 13th Hour. And so the podcast, I would say, is about probably mostly 80s things. I grew up in the 80s, and so probably a lot of that kind of stuff, like movies from that time, as well as I would say the creative process, doing a bunch of creative things. And so it's probably mostly about that.
Okay. That sounds cool. Well, I'll have to check that out. We're doing a series now on the Thank You Notes podcast about people that trained us. So tell me about your medical training. Like, where did you do residency?
So residency I did at University of Massachusetts in Worcester. Yeah, so that's my day job. I don't make a living off of podcasting or writing books as much as I might want to. And in some ways, I'm actually glad I don't, because having a day job gives me the freedom to basically do what I want in terms of the creative side of things. And so if 2 people read it or 200 people read it, it doesn't really matter to me. But that's my day job, and that takes up probably, that, aside from being a dad, takes up, and a husband, probably takes up most of my time.
Is there somebody from your training that was like a mentor to you, and what are some lessons that he or she taught you?
Well, I would say one of the mentors I've had is a wonderful human being, and his name is Doug Burnon. He is, I think, now retired, but he was a supervisor for me in my fellowship. So I'm trained as a child psychiatrist, and so you have to do a couple extra years of training after residency. And so he was supervising me on a particular project I was doing that I still have not finished, and I've been meaning to get back to it. But part of the thing was that I had convinced my the program director, who is a wonderful guy, to give me some time each week to do a creative project, because he knew I liked to write and to draw and things like that. So I set aside some time to basically make a comic book. And the comic book was going to be something that was could be given to a patient to kind of illustrate a particular thing. And so Doug was actually supervising me on this particular project. We would meet generally once a week and just talk about how it was going. For whatever reason, I don't know why I did this, I chose to do the comic book with pictures only, no text. And so I don't know, that seemed like an awfully complicated way of doing it, but that's what I did. So that project, I got through a fair amount of it, and then I think I graduated, and then what stalled out at that project? Probably having kids stalled that project out, but it's still something I meant to get back to. But from that, we met regularly and had a lot of great conversations. Probably the biggest thing that I learned. I've learned many things. I mean, he was just been wise counsel over the years. But probably one of the biggest things I would say was an offhand comment he probably made once, but it stuck with me. And he said, sometimes all you have is the ability to be curious. And as a psychologist, I mean, really, they just have their words, really. And so doubly important for him, I think. But I mean, the sentiment was still something that I took a lot away from, which was that at the end of the day, your ability to be curious about a particular situation, in this case, he's talking about patients and stuff like that, shows them not only respect, but also it's a way of actually getting involved in someone's life in a way that makes it more than just going through and trying to get to the end. I mean, so many times I think you see patient after patient after patient, it all starts to seem the same. And it's very easy to kind of get into a rut and kind of lose focus of important things. And I think the idea of asking questions and being curious and continuing to ask why, why is this happening? Why did that happen in that particular way? I think helps keep things not just interesting for you, but is respectful for them. And sometimes is illustrative for them as well. They may not have thought to ask why.
Yeah, I really like that. I try to maintain a healthy level of curiosity because it keeps you sharp and it keeps you from making mistakes.
Yeah. And in fact, I just, the podcast is a separate podcast, but the one I've been doing for the physician dads on burnout, that's the one I actually recorded a little bit earlier today in between. I had 15 minutes in between patients, and I did it then because I knew I probably wouldn't get to it later, but that's the one for this week. And I was actually on that very same topic about asking why and being curious. So that was directly due to my mentor.
Well, that's a great segue, Josh, because the reason why I wanted to talk to you today is because you have been doing the Revive and Thrive Burnout podcast on, I guess, are we allowed to say physician dads group? I guess the word is out.
I think so. I don't, when I was talking to the admins about it, I don't think it's a secret. So
why did you start doing the podcast?
Essentially, I guess for context, we're talking about a large group of physician fathers who are, gathering together on Facebook. And so, but there would be questions that would come up over and over again. And a number of them would be about burnout in various ways. I would see them and I would always wonder, because people would comment on, here's what you can do. Oh, that sucks. Sorry you're in that position. Have you considered this? Things like that. I always wonder what happens the morning after. What happens the next day? Because it's this half-life of a social media post is maybe a day.
If
After
that.
that, it's going on to the next thing, and it's this endless cycle. So does it translate into anything long term? Because the same questions would come up over and over again. And I wondered, well, what happens if there were more like a consistent space for folks just to think about this and build on knowledge rather than have to recreate the wheel each time? Would that be helpful in any way? Well, I mean, podcasts are episodic, right? I don't need to tell you that, right? So the idea that you can listen to one and hopefully it stands alone, but then, if you went and listened to previous ones, then it would just kind of build on what had come before. And so you could build on knowledge. That's the whole that's how and being a podcast person, that's probably what I thought of.
So what's your definition of burnout? We can start there and then get into the weeds a little bit more.
Well, I mean, there's an official definition. I mean, depending on what you read. I mean, it's not a medical term or anything like that, right? And so you're talking about just a qualitative description. And usually it has a couple different parts. There's a component of exhaustion, usually, mental exhaustion, and a component of separation where you feel depersonalized in some way, dehumanized, or just like disconnected from what you're doing. And then emotional exhaustion. And it's usually, in response to some kind of long-term stressor. And it doesn't have to be work. I mean, it could be anything really. People sometimes usually think about it in reference to war or domestic violence or bullying or something like that. But I mean, it could be really anything. But at the end of the day, I mean, those are ultimately just words. And so I guess if I had to pick a definition, it would be this sort of overwhelming sense that what you're doing is, on one hand, overwhelming, but also meaningless. It feels sort of futile. It feels trapped.
Yeah. You've mentioned on a few of the episodes that you've had your own experiences with burnout. What led you to think that you were experiencing burnout? What were you going through at the time?
Well, I would say it's happened a couple times, I would say. Some work related, some not work related. But the first time, actually, I was in residency, and a lot of residents burn out. It's not really, but I didn't know what that was. I didn't think I was, depressed or anything like that. I wasn't sad, but I noticed that I just hated certain things I did. There were certain days that knowing what would come before me would just fill me with a sense of just utter despair. And kind of somewhat of dread, but it was more like standing in front of an avalanche. It kind of felt like, what's coming,
Yeah.
and it's like you can't really move, and you're like, well, what do I do? You just have to kind of like knuckle down and kind of take it. And so that's what it felt like. And we had to do a grand rounds as part of our. I think it was it must have been my last year in residency. The psychiatry residency is 4 years. Maybe it's third or fourth. I can't remember now. But we had to do it, and I was like, well, maybe there's something written about this. Maybe there's something in the medical literature that talks about this. And I went looking. I didn't know what it was called at the time, but I had a hint that other people had probably talked about it because it wasn't unique. I wasn't talking about anything that was unique. Plenty of other residents talked about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found it. I found there was quite a bit written. And I ended up doing my grand rounds on that, and then sort of some ideas that I came up with in reference to that. And interestingly, it wasn't really talked about that much then, but within a couple of years, then the medical community started to put out lots more stuff about burnout, and there was stuff that would come up in conferences and all these kinds of things. And you started to see wellness seminars and all these things that I was like, well, that would probably help. But oddly enough, it seemed like the crucial part of it, which is that you can take as many vacations, you can do as many exercise classes as you want. But if the actual work that you do still feels overwhelming and meaningless, that it doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah.
On some level, you have to make that part better. You have to find meaning in what you do. And life is short. We only have a certain amount of time. So if you cannot find meaning in what you do, then what is the point? And so I remember grappling with this. And so was probably the first time it was in residency. And then I would say there have been some subsequent episodes. And so I knew I was in it because I had studied it. I would say a non-work related time came, I would say, actually just prior to COVID. And it wasn't really work related, although work did contribute, but it was really just parenting. My kids were pretty young at that time. I was doing a lot of day-to-day house-related stuff, and also, trying to work. I was getting to the point, I think, parenting-wise, where it was not a great place. It was not a place that I wanted to be. I remember sitting down with my wife and we were talking about this. And at the time, she was working a pretty intense job, and there wasn't a whole lot of leeway for what we could do. And so I kind of knew what this was, what was going on at that point, because I'd been through it before in a different context. And oddly enough, the pandemic actually made it better, because now this was a crisis, and it's all hands on deck. And I don't say it actually made things worse in terms of challenge, but because it was something that was different and it was a crisis, I think that helped in an odd kind of way. And I think you saw that in the medical community. Like people were tired and everything like that, and they had this big crisis. And because you were needed, oddly enough, you had purpose. During that time, my kids needed me. I mean, the mental health needs went through the roof. And so you're needed there. And then, so you don't really have time to be burnout. And I think if that had continued on at that pace for however long, I think it probably would have not ended particularly well. And it didn't end well for many people. But thankfully, that was not necessarily a long-standing kind of thing. Things were at least able to get better for me and my family. So I think that, oddly enough, crisis sometimes makes things a little bit better, at least temporarily.
Yeah, I think there was a definite reevaluation of one's priorities when COVID came down, and nobody really knew what was going to happen. And I took this oath that I would help people, and it was really important to me that I would go help people. But like, I'm an anesthesiologist and I stare at tracheas all day. So I was really scared at the outset, because like, I know I'm going to get this. Yeah, I see what you mean about there's a crisis and now all of a sudden you have a purpose, and the lack of purpose is kind of what led you down to this road of burnout. But now that you kind of have one, I guess it made things better for a while.
Yeah, I think it can. I think the risk that we run into is that, in medicine, there's no shortage of crises, right? You can have one after another and live your whole life or career that way. And you can't sustain that long term.
No.
I don't think. I mean, it's interesting because the people that trained me, maybe both of us, I mean, that generation of folks who sort of lived to work, and that was their whole existence. Maybe they could, they would live at the hospital, and they were residents in the truest sense of the word, because they never left, right?
Yes.
And but I don't know what happened with their families, who raised their kids, what they did when they weren't at work. I mean, I got the impression from talking to some of their spouses, offline, that they were basically absent as parents. And so I don't think that was just true of all of them, but I don't think I could live that way. And so there's too many other things that I like to do.
Yeah, true. So when one doesn't have the luxury of a pandemic to snap you out of it, what do you suggest to anybody who may be experiencing burnout?
Well, I kind of think, I don't know if anybody's ever compared it this way, but I kind of think, like, once you get to that point, it's not like it ever really 100% goes away. I think it's maybe a little bit like being an alcoholic. You always continue to deal with the risk of it recurring at some point, unless there's a lot of things that change that make it possible for you to not get back to that point. However, in our career, there's a limit to what we can realistically do when we look at a lot of the challenges I think that physicians face from a systemic perspective.
Mm.
And so if those things are frustrating to you, then they probably will continue to be frustrating, whether you are 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or retired or whatever. I mean, I don't think that's going to change very much. So I think that it ultimately is about what you can do yourself that brings meaning to what you do and allows you to take care of yourself and put some limits on how far you stretch. So I think that was part of the point of the podcast, because it's easy to talk about these things. It's easy to talk about the theory and all this other stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you got to do something. Well, you don't have to do anything, right? You can choose to do nothing, right? Doing nothing is always an option, but that whole, certainly as I talk about with patients, it's an option, but it has its own side effects, right? And so there's a lot that you can do, and that was part of the point of the podcast. But there's some things that I found helpful, therapy, individual therapy. I think just getting older helps. I mean, you just become more comfortable in your own skin. I've noticed it's a lot easier, compared to say, like, I don't know, medical school or residency, being able to say, I don't know. I don't, with patients, they present a problem, when you're younger and you're more inexperienced, you're bound to be more insecure, and you start to fudge things more, someone's senior asks you a question, and the answer, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff like that. After a certain point, you hopefully get to a point where like, I don't know, you're not expected to know everything. I'll look it up later, and some people never really get to that point. But there's too much to know. And I think when we pretend that we know everything or are immune to that, I mean, we're just kidding ourselves. I think even being able to say, like, I don't care. You can't care about everything. Just being able to say, like, look, not my circus. Not my circus, not my monkeys. That's your problem. You deal with it. Above my pay grade. I think being able to put some limits on what you're going to deal with, I mean, there's always stuff coming down, spit rolls downhill, right? And so there's always stuff coming down. You got to do this or this other regulation or blah, 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 this other paperwork thing to fill out, or this new rule to follow, or do this. If it's that important, someone will figure out how to get you to do it. But otherwise, does it really matter? Probably not.
That's actually become my policy on emails, is that I just delete all of them. And then the ones that from, places I don't, and then if they really want to get me, that they'll start emailing me again, because it's just too much.
Life is too short to spend it answering emails, right? It's possible to be, I guess, positively procrastinating with email, but does it really get you anything? I don't know. Exercise, I think, is really important. I try to make a point to exercise daily. It doesn't have to be a lot necessarily, but I think just movement in general. I mean,
yes,
it's important. I mean, when there was a time a number of years ago when a large part of my day was spent sitting in a chair, and I would leave the end of the day feeling 20 years older. Everything would hurt. And it had something to do with the sitting surface and all that kind of stuff like that. But I don't do that anymore. I've come up with other ways of doing it, and it's worth it to me. But I think you have to find something that works for you in that way. I think when we get stressed, we do a whole bunch of things in our body that sometimes are not very adaptive, but our body responds in the same way. I noticed that, when I'd be stressed at work, I'd have a tendency to kind of lean forward in the chair and then not actually use the back support at all. I have a tendency to round out my shoulders and hunch over and, do that 10 hours a day or whatever it is you're working when you're seeing patients or typing out notes or on the phone or whatever other stuff you're doing. It adds up. So I try to spend time stretching. I definitely lost flexibility in my lower back and hamstrings and areas like that for a while during that period of time when I was spending a lot of time sitting, and it was not good for my body. So nothing, I think, makes you feel more burnt out than dealing with chronic pain, because it's a thing that nags at you and it makes everything worse.
I actually just listened to your episode about posture, P for posture. And I didn't really see where you were going with it, but then, yeah, and that's kind of the thing that I like about the Revive and Thrive is that there's some actionable things that you can do, or maybe things that you didn't think of that may be contributing to not just your burnout, but just your overall bad mood. And that being one of them. And I think if I had to sum it up, it's how to change your practices and change your mindsets and maybe chip away at the burnout block.
Yeah. I think so I've been involved, I've started martial arts, when I was 13 or something. I've been doing that ever since. And I think, sometimes those kind of practices and things like that have been very helpful. And I think one way to look at it is sometimes people will, when they're just getting involved with something like that, I'll just use the example of martial arts because it just happens to come to mind. But they'll say like, well, when is the best time I should work on, something like my flexibility or strength or something like that, or coordination. You can set aside specific times to do that. But ultimately, it's all about movement and finding a way to incorporate those things into your day-to-day life so that you're constantly practicing. It may not be a official session where you're saying like, okay, I'm going to go practice this technique or whatever for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever. You're just doing it throughout the day as part of your life. And
Right.
So I think that's the approach that I took with some aspects of those podcast episodes, because there's little things that you can incorporate into your workday for sure, but also in other aspects of your life, like your life as a father or husband or whatever. And I guess the other thing, the most important thing, it probably is meaning, because all these other things are great, but if it's, you can't polish a turd, right? If you cannot find meaning in what you do, then I'm not really sure why you should be doing it. So I work with students in a college setting, and I have said no to most other things that are not that. So working in inpatient units and all those other kinds of things like that, that often will come with most other jobs. I've tried to minimize call, and because that is what I like to do. And the other stuff I find to be a drain. I find it to be a high ticket to burnout.
Yes.
And feeling negative about what I do. And so I figured if I'm going to try to have some longevity at all in this field of medicine, in this arena, then I'm going to have to find a way to prioritize the things that actually give me some pleasure and some of the things I'm actually good at. And I feel privileged to be able to work with students who are, struggling at a sort of crucial point in their life, and, helping be a voice for them as they're finding theirs is rewarding. Now, it won't be that for everybody, but making that a priority has been helpful. But I've had to say no to many other things, other good opportunities and other things that people wanted me to do, and sort of said like, well, you should really be doing this. And I said, can't help everybody.
What is it about working with college age students? Like, how did you come to find that as your calling?
It's a good question. I don't really know. I think I've always wanted to do it throughout residency. Maybe I remember telling people about that, and they said, "Oh, okay." I didn't. I encountered very few people that did it, but I always thought it would be interesting. I think I've always been interested in that particular transition between childhood and adulthood. With psychiatry, you get trained to be an adult psychiatrist first.
Mm-hmm.
Learning how to work with families and those kind of things like that is very important. But then, as a child psychiatrist, which I did the next part of my training, you often spend a lot of time working with smaller children, and also with families, but mainly parents. And so, I was sort of interested in an intersection between the two. So, neither one really kind of they both helped, but neither one kind of totally prepared me for it. But I think at that particular point in your life, you're not quite a kid, you're not quite an adult. You have aspects of both. So it was interesting to me in that way. And that's a time when you have a lot of stuff that's before you, a lot of big decisions in your life. But, people's brains are not developed to the point where they are when they're older. And so there's a lot of turmoil in that point. I think for a lot of people, their late teens and their 20s are just like a awash with, who am I? How do I fit in the world? All these other kinds of sort of almost like existential kinds of things. So it was an interesting period of time. And I guess I also found I'm not a super activist kind of person, like rah, 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 save the whales or whatever, but I've noticed that society tends to rail against the new generation. So the more they tended to rail against the millennials and the Gen Zs, I was like, well, why? Well, what's so special about you? The previous generations did it to you. So I guess the more they kind of got on those on the case of younger folks, the more, I guess, impassioned I became in wanting to at least help speak for them. So I think those are some little things.
I think a lot about us doctors, because a lot of us made the decision to go to medical school when we were in that period of time in our life. Like I was 19 and I was an idiot. And there's a lot of weight that gets put on the decisions that you make with that not fully formed brain. And I just always think about that when I encounter patients or anybody from that age group, and the fact that you dedicated your life to that is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably a little bit older when I came to that decision to go into medicine, but it wasn't a decision that came easily, and it was one I grappled with, I would say, probably for years. I didn't come to full peace of it until probably I was in the middle of residency. So, I think it's one of those things that you never make decisions with the full information, and that's often much of life, I guess, right?
Right.
And I think it's probably even maybe a little bit harder for folks today because there's more information at your fingertips. The world is, I don't know if it's more complicated. Maybe it is. Maybe it seems more complicated. I don't know, but there's a lot more possibilities that seem open because there is just more information. So I think that adds to it for the current generation.
All right, Josh, we've gotten to the thank you notes portion of the episode. I wrote you a little thank you note. It says, "Dear Josh, thank you for creating the Revive and Thrive Burnout podcast. The response I've been noticing on the PDG has been great, and I've really enjoyed reading and participating in the discussions that come with every episode. You're doing this just out of the love of your heart and the love of your fellow physicians. And with this burnout epidemic that we are currently experiencing throughout medicine, we doctors are going to have to look out for each other. And thanks for doing that for us. Thank you, Travis."
Well, thank you. So you had asked me to write a thank you note as well.
I did.
So I'd written thank yous to a couple different people, I guess. So I wanted to thank all the different people in my life who served as my teachers. Okay. So I didn't know that it was going to be, you were going to have a sort of series on mentors and teachers and stuff like that. But that's kind of where my thoughts went anyway. And so I would say, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the people in my life who served as my teachers. And so it starts with my parents, first and foremost, and they've continued in that way on into the present. I'd like to thank my teachers in school who took the time to pass on knowledge, as well as mentors that I've had, either formal or informal, that I've had over the years. And I'd like to thank people I haven't met, but who wrote books that I read as a child that inspired me, or who were involved in things like creative works like movies or things like that, or music that maybe want to do those things or inspired me in some way, or been a source of comfort. I'd like to thank all my patients over the years. I've learned a lot from my patients, and they've helped me to become not just a better doctor, but also recognizing a lot of things I don't know. And I'm often humbled by their honesty and willingness to share very difficult aspects of their life with a total stranger. On a more personal level, like I thank all the people who supported something creative that I've done over the years, listening to music that I've made, or read books that I've written, or checking out my other podcast, or buying things that I've made, toys and stuff like that I've created, which originally, a lot of that stuff was originally just for me or my kids. These are things that I would have done anyway, regardless if anybody was listening or paying attention. But it is certainly nice to meet other people who are interested in similar things. And I've been appreciative of that. They can share the journey. And, piggybacking off of that, I'd like to thank all my guests who I've had on my podcast over the past 9 years. And I've learned a lot from them. And I probably wouldn't have met a lot of those people in day-to-day life So I'm very grateful for something that just started as I don't want to say throwaway idea, but I never really thought that that podcast I've been doing for the last 9 years would lead to the kind of friendships and kind of relationships that I've been able to make. And so I'm grateful for that. And lastly, I'd like to thank my wife and my children, not only for their love, but just continuing to teach me things all the time about their world and how they experience things. And then, well, actually, there's a PS. Thank you, Travis, for inviting me to the podcast.
You know, Josh, you're the first person to include me in their thank you note.
Really?
Yes. Well, somebody thanked the group that I work for, but to that you were the first person to thank me by name. So let the record state that Josh Blum was the first person to thank me on here.
It seems like it should thank you, being it's a thank you podcast. So yeah.
One would think, but we're, I don't know, 20 some odd episodes in, and you're the first person to come to that realization. So
I'm sure it'll happen again.
I hope so.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's you. I guess you painted all the corners there. You knocked them all out. I really enjoyed hearing that, and it seems like you have a healthy sense of gratitude for the people in your life, the people you know, the people you don't know, and that's translated, I guess, a healthy well-being for you.
I've gotten that way. I wouldn't say that's always been the case, but it's a process. I try to end each day thinking about some of the things that went well, some of the things I'm thankful for, and I think that has been a conscious choice, and I think that's something that's helped. I would say over the years. Maybe I should do an episode on that particular thing, because that's a little actionable step that I've taken in my own life to work on these kinds of things.
Yeah, I guess you still haven't done episode T for thank you note.
Maybe I should do that. So link back to this one.
We will. Okay, last question, Josh. I asked this for most podcasters that come on here. Who is your dream podcast guest, and what would you talk about?
My dream podcast guest, aside from Travis from the Thank You Notes podcast,
I'd say you could dream a little bigger.
Yeah, I would say I've had most of my dream guests, to be honest with you.
Like who?
So let's see. About a year ago, I'm a big fan of the movie The Rocketeer from 1991. I like that movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but
I have. Well, I saw it when I was like 10, but
yeah, we're probably about the same age. So I saw it then, and over the years, it just became my favorite movie. And so Billy Campbell, who plays the Rocketeer in the movie, he came on the show about a year ago. That was definitely one of my dream guests. He was a great guy and a wonderful human being. And there's been a couple others that are similar like that. But like I said, I've gotten a chance to connect with people through that podcast in a way that I never really thought would be possible. I never would have met any of these people in day-to-day life. And through that, I have. It's taken obviously a lot of work and those kind of things like that, but that's okay.
Okay. That's life. And the post dream guest bliss.
Well, yeah, I would say, like, with every mountain you cross, there's always another one, right? There's always more things to do. And I think by doing that, you keep life interesting. For example, you had mentioned the last thank you note that I wrote. So the last thank you note that I had written, I mean, it happens to be another movie sort of thing. I don't have movie related folks on the podcast that often, but I do sometimes. And so if you've ever seen the 1986 movie Space Camp, this was, well, it's a sort of a capsule in time. I liked it when it was my favorite movie when I was probably about 9. An astronaut for a long time. And so one of the cast members, Leah Thompson, who you remember from Back to the Future.
Oh, yeah.
The Duck.
Oh, yeah.
So I was communicating with her, and I was thanking her for her role in Space Camp, because it made me want to be an astronaut for like 10 years.
Here at Space Camp, the movie, I just looked it up.
Yes.
Oh, I love me some Leah Thompson, Red Dawn especially.
Now, that's one I have not seen in quite a while, but yes.
Oh, man. Oh, I love that movie.
Well, I'll have to go back. Maybe in your honor, I'll have to go back and rewatch it. I probably haven't seen it since I was a teenager, but yeah. I
don't know. Do you enjoy like movies that are so bad that they're good?
Yeah. I watched a lot of them for the podcast, to be honest with you. Yeah. My brother and I do. We sort of it ends up being sort of monthly, but it generally is something from the 80s. But it's like because I write a lot of fantasy related stuff, so we often will do an 80s fantasy movie, and there's some real turkeys in there. But I mean, they have a certain charm to them. Sometimes the worse they are, the better they are.
Well, I never know, like, did they really set out to make a movie this bad knowing that it would be good, or did they really think that this is people are going to think this is really cool?
Sometimes I think it's both.
Uh-huh.
I guess there's lots of different ways of entertaining people, right? And so whatever works.
Whatever puts the butts in the seats.
That's true.
All right, Josh, this has been really nice. Thank you for coming on, and I'll be listening to the rest of the Revive and Thrive pod.
Sure. Thank you for your support. And thank you for having me on.
Josh and I stayed on the call and chatted a bit after we were done. He's a good guy. I enjoyed getting to spend some time with him. If you would like to be like Josh and thank me, interact with the show through any of the social media accounts, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn, or you can email me at thankyouNotespod@gmail.com. Send me a thank you note for me, your dog, your mom, your teacher, anybody, and I might feature it on the show. Please like, subscribe, rate, review, praise, exalt, and publicly cherish this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.